On 28 July 1942, while Hitler was still celebrating the capture of Rostov, Stalin sensed that the moment of crisis was at hand. Soviet forces retreating from Paulus's Sixth Army faced annihilation west of the Don. If the Germans then advanced across the Volga, 40 miles further on, the country would be cut in two. Convoy PQ-17 had just been destroyed in the Barents Sea, and the new Anglo-American supply line across Persia would soon be threatened. The Soviet Union faced strangulation. That day, Stalin suddenly stopped pacing up and down in his office in the Kremlin while listening to a report from General Vasilevsky. "They've forgotten my Stavka order," he burst out. This order, issued the previous August, stated that anyone who removes his insignia during battle and surrenders should be regarded as a malicious deserter, whose family is to be arrested as the family of a breaker of the oath and betrayer of the motherland. Such deserters are to be shot on the spot. Those falling into encirclement and who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by any means, while their families are to be deprived of all state allowance and assistance. "They've forgotten it," Stalin said again. "Write a new one on the same lines." "When do you want me to report with the new order?" Vasilevsky asked. "Today. Come back as soon as it is ready." Vasilevsky returned that evening with the draft of Order No. 227, more commonly known as Not One Step Backwards. Stalin made many changes, then signed it. The order was to be read to all troops in the Red Army. Panic-mongers and cowards must be destroyed on the spot. The retreat mentality must be decisively eliminated. Army commanders who have allowed the voluntary abandonment of positions must be removed and sent for immediate trial by military tribunal. Anyone who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland. Each army had to organize 3 to 5 well-armed detachments, up to 200 men each, to form a second line to shoot down any soldier who tried to run away. 3 camps were set up for the interrogation of anyone who had escaped from German custody or encirclement. Commanders permitting retreat were to be stripped of their rank and sent to penal companies or battalions. The first on the Stalingrad front came into being 3 weeks later, on 22 August, the day before the Germans reached the Volga. Penal companies, Strafroti, were to perform semi-suicidal tasks such as mine clearance during an attack. Altogether, some 422,700 Red Army men would atone with their blood for the crimes they have committed before the motherland. The idea so appealed to the Soviet authorities that civilian prisoners were transferred from every member of a small detachment of the 29th Motorized Division of 4th Panzer Army was interrogated by Lieutenant Lipinskaya from the political department of Southwestern Front headquarters. Her questions to gauge their morale provided little encouraging material. "Most of the soldiers want to fight to the end," she had to report. "No cases of desertion or self-inflicted wounds. Officers strict but fair." Lipinskaya had more luck with Romanian prisoners. An officer admitted that his men hated Marshal Antonescu for having sold their motherland to Germany. Romanian soldiers were even more forthcoming. They told her of fistfights with Germans, even that a German officer had been killed after he shot 2 of their comrades. Their own officers were very rude to them and often struck them. There had been numerous cases of self-inflicted wounds, despite lectures from officers that they were a sin against the motherland and God. Lipinskaya concluded that the Romanians were clearly in a low political moral state. Her report was passed rapidly back to Moscow. The advance across the Don steppe provided many mixed experiences for the Sixth Army after the winter snows. General Strecker, the commander of 11th Corps, found it as hot as Africa, with huge dust clouds. On July 22, his chief of staff, Helmut Grosskert, recorded a temperature of 53 degrees in the sun. Sudden rains, while temporarily turning tracks to mire, did little to solve the water shortage, which was the main preoccupation of the German Landser during that time. The Russians polluted wells during the retreat, while collective farm buildings were destroyed and tractors and cattle driven to the rear.
Supplies which could not be moved in time were rendered unusable. A corporal wrote home on August 10th, "The Russians have poured petrol over the grain supplies." A panzer division reported, "Soviet bombers drop phosphorus bombs at night to set the steppe on fire." But many of the columns of black smoke on the horizon were started by cordite burns around artillery positions. The German gunners in shorts, with their bronze torsos muscled from the lifting of shells, looked like athletes from a Nazi propaganda film, but conditions were not as healthy as they might have appeared. Cases of dysentery, typhus, and paratyphus began to increase. Around field ambulances, cookhouses, and especially butchery sections, the plague of flies was horrible, reported one doctor. They were most dangerous for those with open wounds, such as the burns of tank crewmen. The continual movement forward made it very difficult to care for the sick and wounded. Evacuation by a Sanitet's U air ambulance was the best hope, but Hitler's insistence on speed meant that almost every transport aircraft had been diverted to deliver fuel to halted panzer divisions. For soldiers of the Sixth Army, the summer of 1942 offered the last idols of war. In Don Cossack country, the villages of whitewashed cottages with thatched roofs, surrounded by small cherry orchards,
General Vasily Chukov, soon to become the army commander in Stalingrad, was one of the most ruthless of this new generation. His explosions of temper were compared to those of Zhukov. His strong peasant face and thick hair were typically Russian. He also had a robust sense of humor and a bandit laugh which exposed gold-crowned teeth. Soviet propaganda later portrayed him as the ideal product of the October Revolution. Chukov had missed the first disastrous 6 months of war, having been in China as a military attaché accredited to Chiang Kai-shek. After his recall to the Soviet Union, he became acting commander of a reserve army near Tula. Early in July, when still suffering from a spinal injury, he received orders to move his incomplete divisions, now designated the 64th Army, to hold the Germans west of the Don. Chukov, accompanied by his chief commissar, Konstantin Kirkovich Abramov, reached Stalingrad front headquarters on 16 July. They heard that the enemy was advancing rapidly towards the Don, but nobody had any details. The 62nd Army was spread out on the upper part of the Don's eastern loop, and Chukov had to bring his divisions in to cover the lower part, south of the River Chir. He was understandably worried about the morale of the army on his left, having intercepted a lorry full of officers with spare cans of fuel, escaping to the rear without permission. Just to his right, above the River Chir, the Austrian 44th Infantry Division was heavily engaged against 3 divisions of 62nd Army. The fighting was particularly brutal. A captured corporal told his interrogator that an officer had ordered them to shoot 2 wounded Red Army soldiers they had found hiding in a ditch. Further north, however, the Germans had broken through in strength, cutting off many regiments when they reached the Don at Kamensky. German reconnaissance planes quickly pinpointed the weak points along the Don and the deployment of Chukov's forward divisions. On 25 July, the Germans attacked in force. This baptism of fire for the 64th Army was not made any simpler by dust storms, nor by the fact that essential detachments were still stuck behind in Tula. The next morning brought a German armored attack, and although the panzers terrified the crews of the light T-60 tanks, who tried to hide in gullies, their shells could do little to the heavy KV tanks. They had a longer range, explained a German panzer commander. We could not attack them across the open. So, like ships at sea, I pulled my tanks right back out of sight, made a wide detour, and attacked them from behind. The Russian heavy tanks scattered, except for one which had lost a track. Its traverse mechanism had jammed, so the turret could not turn. We lined up behind him and started to shoot.
We counted our hits on this tank, but none of them penetrated the armor. Then I saw the hatch of the tank move. I guessed that they wanted to surrender, so over the radio I told my company to cease fire. The Russians then opened the hatch completely and climbed out. The crew were totally confused, shaken, and deafened, but not one of them was even wounded. It was depressing to realize.
Despite the disasters and chaos from bad communications, Red Army units continued to fight back. They made the most of night raids, since an attack during daylight immediately brought a response from the Luftwaffe. The German company commander, who kept a diary in the 384th Infantry Division, recorded on August 2, "Russians resisting hard. These are fresh troops and young." And again the next day, "Russians resisting hard. They are getting reinforcements all the time. One of our sapper companies avoided battle. Very shameful." His own soldiers then began to suffer badly from stomachache, perhaps due to contaminated water. "It's terrible here," he wrote a few days later. "Such terrifying nights. Every single one of us is tense. One's nerves don't stand a chance." In an attempt to counter Luftwaffe air superiority, Red Army aviation regiments were transferred hurriedly from the central and northern fronts. A regiment of night fighters landing for the first time at a new base to support the Stalingrad front discovered that their aerodrome was no more than a large field planted with watermelons and surrounded by tomato plants, which the local peasants continued to harvest even while fighters landed and took off. The regiment's presence was soon spotted by a Focke-Wulf reconnaissance aircraft, and when strafing Messerschmitts came in just above ground level, the adjacent peasant market was caught in their fire. In an instant, the rural scene became one of total chaos, with panic-stricken horses rearing in the shafts of wagons, children screaming, awnings ripped by machine gun bullets, and stallholders killed among their fruit and vegetables. Less damage was done to the night fighter regiment, which found itself forced to maintain an exhausting schedule of sorties. Often there was no time to eat at the field kitchen by the side of the runway, so ground crew would bring plates out to the aircraft at dispersal, and pilots ate in their cockpit. The rules of security drummed into the ground personnel by commissars were so absolute that they never counted the number of aeroplanes on the field, or even how many failed to return from a mission. In the confused air skirmishes at this time, Major Kondrashov, the commander of the regiment, was shot down behind German lines. His left leg, which he later lost, was mangled in the crash, but a peasant woman who lived nearby managed to drag him clear of the wreckage and care for him in her house. The site had been marked by fellow pilots from his regiment, and soon after dawn, 2 of them landed by her house. They carried Kondrashov out and bundled him into the rear seat of one of the aircraft. The pilot then flew him to a military hospital. Aerial dogfights over the Don during those last days of July and early August attracted the attention of the whole battlefield below. German infantrymen and panzer crews alike would shade their eyes with a hand against the sun, peering up at the blue sky and vapor trails. Russian aircraft generally attacked ground targets at midday. It was such a regular run that Messerschmitt 109s would often make sure that they were around, ready to jump them. There were cheers whenever an enemy machine. The initial shock was soon over. A company from the 2nd Panzer Regiment arrived, and very soon 6 T-34Ss were ablaze on the open on some marshy low ground. One T-34, in a suicidal attack, charged at the divisional transport vehicles in the village, but suddenly encountered a German panzer, which, with a direct hit at point-blank range, literally blasted its turret into the air. Hubei, after observing the early morning action, remarked to Podewils, "You'd better go up to the front line. It's safer there." Podewils and his companion left later in the morning. They drove forward over the corduroy road across the marsh. One of the blackened T-34s still smoldered. It gave off the smell of burnt flesh.
At Corps headquarters, he heard that over the last 8 days, the Red Army had sent nearly 1,000 tanks across the Don. Just over half of them had been destroyed. These figures were greatly exaggerated. The Red Army commander only had 550 tanks allocated, and many of them never managed to cross the Don. Wildly over-optimistic reports from the front were largely to blame. One Panzer crewman observed that whenever a Russian tank was hit, almost every Panzer in the battle claimed it as a kill. Yet the sight of so many destroyed Russian tanks impressed all who saw it. General von Seydlitz said that from afar the shot-out KVs looked like an enormous herd of elephants. Whatever the exact figure destroyed, many Germans felt convinced that they must be close to total victory. The Russian Hydra could not go on forever, growing more heads for them to chop off. The Führer, again frustrated at the slow progress, reverted to the original plan of the 4th Panzer Army assisting the 6th Army to capture Stalingrad. The loss in time and the cost in fuel were not mentioned. Hoth's armored divisions reacted quickly. Advancing north against very weak opposition, they soon threatened Kotelnikovo, just under 100 miles southwest of Stalingrad. But the main question was whether they could make up for Hitler's changes of plan. General von Richthofen, on the basis of the air reconnaissance reports, noted in his diary on 2 August, "The Russians are throwing forces from all directions towards Stalingrad." Paulus, in a confident mood, according to Richthofen, launched pincer attacks led by 16th and 24th Panzer Divisions and supported by Richthofen's Stukas. After 2 days of fighting, they surrounded 8 rifle divisions and all the artillery left west of the Don. The encirclement was finally accomplished at Kalach. From the top of a small precipice overlooking the quiet Don, the 1st Panzer crews gazed across at the town of Kalach in the violet evening light. The setting sun behind their tanks threw long shadows in front of them towards the east. Beyond Kalach, the steppe stretched ahead to Stalingrad. Kalach itself consisted mainly of small workshops, a dilapidated railway station, and höchst primitive wooden shacks. After their success, the panzer crews joked among themselves with relief and happiness coming down from the tension of battle. Songs rang out from some of the tanks, but soon their commanders pulled them back into hedgehog defensive position. After dusk had fallen, the thousands of Russian stragglers trapped on the west bank started to attack, and the night was continually broken with bursts of machine gun fire, flares, and crackling exchanges of rifle fire. The next day, the Germans started to clear the woods systematically, a number of officers comparing it to a rather large deer shoot. The prisoners taken included a senior signals officer and his personnel, most of whom were women. That night, another battle broke out, this time.
Young schoolchildren, meanwhile, were put to work building earth walls round the petroleum storage tanks on the banks of the Volga. Supervised by teachers, they carried the earth on wooden stretchers. A German aircraft suddenly appeared. The girls did not know where to hide, and the explosion from a bomb buried 2 14-year-old girls. When their classmates dug them out, they found that one of them, Nina Grebenikova, was paralyzed with a broken back. Her shocked and weeping friends cleaned off the wooden stretcher and carried her on it to a Stalingrad hospital, next to where the Tsaritsa Gorge opens onto the Volga. Anti-aircraft defenses were a high priority, but many of the guns had not yet received shells. Most batteries were formed with young women, mainly Komsomol members, who had been recruited in April with the inescapably pointed question, "Do you want to defend your motherland?" Batteries were sited on both banks of the Volga to defend key installations such as the power station at Bekaklovka just to the south and the large factories in the northern sector of the town. There, the workers on arms production lines, such as the Stalingrad tractor factory, which had converted to the production of T-34 tanks, received rudimentary military training. The Stalin Defense Committee issued decree after decree.
collective farms were ordered to hand their grain reserves over to the Red Army. Tribunals were set up to try those who failed in their patriotic duty. Failure to denounce a member of the family who deserted or failed to enlist carried a 10-year sentence. The director of a high school ordered to take 66 of his 17-year-old pupils to enlist them at the District Military Commission was put in front of a tribunal because 31 of them deserted en route. Tribunals also dealt in absentia with civilian deserters, most of them denounced by retreating refugees. Those pronounced guilty were sentenced as a traitor to the party and to the Soviet state. Full time to come, the political department of the Stalingrad Front paid special attention to the investigation of male conscripts from regions of the Ukraine liberated by the Red Army in the winter 1941-42. Those who refused to evacuate their towns and villages were by definition suspect of being systematically anti-Soviet and of having collaborated with the Germans. Declarations in Moscow about freedom of religion carried little weight in the Stalingrad region. The head of the agricultural bank in one district, who sent his brother, an officer in the Red Army, some prayers advising him to recite them before battle, was condemned for anti-party action. Civilians also had to be very careful about the commenting on the speed of the German advance or the incompetence of the Russian defense. A.M., a worker in a Volga fish factory, was accused of political and moral degeneracy and counter-revolutionary propaganda because he allegedly praised the Germans and blackened the leaders of the party, the government, and the Red Army. Stalin, warned of the atmosphere of panic behind the front, resorted once again to changing commanders. Having dismissed Timoshenko on July 21 to replace him with General V.N. Gordov, supervised by Vasilevsky, he then decided in early August to split the front into two commands, with the southern part extending from the Tsaritsa at the center of Stalingrad southward into the Kalmyk steppe. Colonel